All right, let's just jump straight into it. When you picture 13th century Europe, your mind probably goes straight to knights, castles, or, wizards casting spells up in some dark tower. And right at the center of that whole mystical folklore is this legendary and honestly wildly misunderstood figure, Michael Scot. The guy was a brilliant scholar, but over the centuries, his actual real-world scientific work just got completely buried under mountains of myth. So in this explainer, we're stripping all that folklore away. We are walking right through the doors of his actual physical workspace, the Toledo laboratory, to see the fiery birth of something literally modern. Now, to really appreciate the reality here, we've got to unpack the myth first. For centuries, the rumor mill said Michael Scot could literally transmute lead into gold. People whispered that the famously unsolvable voynich manuscript was actually his personal recipe book for the Philosopher's Stone, basically a magical apothecary guide. And hey, it's a fantastic story, right? The lone rogue genius tapping into mystical forces to rewrite the laws of nature. But honestly, the truth of what he was actually doing is way more fascinating than the fiction. Because when you look at the historical record, it just totally flips the script. Scot wasn't some wizard in a robe casting spells. He was an operator on a highly structured system that we now call entrepreneurial alchemy. We're talking about state-funded protochemical laboratories that were bound by strict legal and financial contracts. These were not mystical quests. They were heavily backed projects completely focused on explicit, quantitative metallurgical results. This was big business. Think of it as the birth of industrial mining and systematic metallurgy. Basically a state-funded tech startup, just, in the 13th century. The contrast here is just staggering. Swap out the magic wands, the whispered spells, and the reading of tea leaves for roaring furnaces, sealed closed vessels, and hardcore mass loss calculations. That was his daily workflow. He wasn't conjuring gold out of thin air. He was doing the absolute grueling, dirty, and incredibly dangerous work of an early protochemist. It took extreme precision, heavy math, and this deep practical understanding of exactly how natural materials react to intense heat and pressure. So let's talk about the physical setup he created down in Spain, because the hardware of Toledo is absolutely crucial here. He built a complete industrial-grade chemical laboratory. We're talking heavy-duty equipment. He had these massive crucibles made specifically for melting raw metals at insane temperatures. He used alembics, which are these specialized glass or metal tools, for careful, controlled distillation. And maybe most importantly, he required closed vessels to contain toxic mercury fumes. Because, let's be real, this was not a casual hobby. Dealing with boiling mercury without modern ventilation, if you didn't have sealed environments, you simply wouldn't survive the experiment. Which begs the question, where did all these highly dangerous materials even come from? Well, Toledo wasn't picked by accident. It was geographically perfectly positioned to support a massive logistical supply chain. Yes, Spain was a huge hub for knowledge translation, but it was also just packed with raw mineral wealth. So, step one of Scot's operation was the intensive mining of cinnabar, this bright red ore, and quicksilver, which is raw mercury, pulling it straight out of the Spanish Sierras. Step two was physically lugging that heavy mineral wealth down from the mountains directly to his Toledo facility. And then step three was the actual processing, using those crucibles and alembics to separate and refine everything. It was a massive, incredibly well-oiled machine. And that brings us to one of the most famous mysteries on the planet. For over a century, the voynich manuscript has completely baffled cryptographers. But if you look at it through the lens of Scot's Toledo laboratory, a totally different picture snaps into focus. Far from being this mysterious magical cipher hiding supernatural secrets, the Johnson Voynich Laboratory Manual is actually a technical apothecary guide. It is a master operational ledger written by Michael Scot himself, mapping out the exact dry mathematical procedures you needed to run that complex Spanish lab. And the absolute proof of this is in the Master Operational Glossary. When you translate those famously unsolvable glyphs and rotate them 180 degrees, they map one-to-one onto standard medieval laboratory instructions. For example, the figure 8 represents a drum, the primary unit of weight. That 4P symbol, that's a scruple, which was used as a process valve or separator. 8AW means stasis, an instruction for the exact duration of chemical rest. 8M means maceration, telling the operator to soak the raw materials. And 8V is the final refined extract. See, there's absolutely no magic here. It's a spreadsheet. It's a precise, dry, highly technical ledger. And if you want to talk about technical rigor, we have to look at the number 1.16. In the so-called biological section of the Voynich manuscript, the pages with all those weird pipes and tubs, it's actually a visual calculation for mass loss. Scot calculated a strict 1.16-bit entropy deficit. So to figure out the final dosage of a refined material, he explicitly instructed his operators to subtract this exact 1.16 factor to account for the mass that was lost to evaporation and chemical wastes from the raw starting weight. That is rigorous mathematical protochemistry happening right in front of us. The guy even accounted for the weather. The manuscript has these wavy lines in certain diagrams that for years experts thought were just, decorative art or some kind of mystical energy. Nope. They actually translate to an instruction for high humidity. Scott knew that if the air was super humid, his mass loss deficit would go up. So his manual literally dictates that under those specific environmental conditions, you have to add exactly 1 scruple, that 4p symbol, of raw material to your starting weight just to compensate. That is next-level quality control for the 13th century. This level of precise measurement completely solves the whole astrology mystery of the manuscript, too. While the text is definitely packed with stars and zodiac symbols, they aren't horoscopes. They are heat equations. The stars are actually thermal units. So if you see a page with high star density, usually paired with summer zodiacs, that's an instruction to apply maximum solar heat for rapid maceration. A page with low star density, that means cooling as required, and that cooling was specifically needed to execute a triple stasis, literally written out as ADA, ADA, ADA. That was a mandatory chemical rest period used to stabilize highly toxic stuff like nightshade or mercury. It's a temperature gauge, guys, not a fortune teller. So who exactly was footing the bill for all this meticulous science? Enter the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II. This guy had an immense geographical ambition. Acting remarkably like a modern-day venture capitalist, he funded Michael Scott's project to essentially survey and map geological resources. He specifically targeted Bæolian or Lipari Islands, right off the coast of Sicily. He was hunting for sulfur beds and, of course, gold all across his empire. He was literally having them look directly into the mouths of volcanoes to figure out where the Earth cooked its own metals. But what does the state demand in return for funding all this state-of-the-art protochemistry? Well, exactly what you'd expect: power and money. The emperor absolutely required the extraction and purification of pure gold to mint his famous Augustulus coins. He essentially used Scott's mathematical genius to lock in strict standardization of weights and measures across the entire kingdom. That meant the state could finally enforce harsh sanctions against counterfeiters because they had a real scientific baseline for true gold. Oh, and on top of that, the state demanded reliable, high-grade medicines and refined botanical extracts for the royal court. Naturally, a multi-stage industrial operation this complex needed a master map to keep it all straight. And that is exactly what the incredibly famous large rosette map in the Voynich manuscript, folio 86V, actually is. It is not a map of the cosmos. It's the magnum opus flowchart. It literally maps out the entire workflow of the Toledo laboratory. You harvest the raw materials in the outer circles, you move them inward through the 4P process valves, where they get measured in scruples and distilled, until the whole operation converges right at the central equilibrium hub, where the final perfected medicinal or metallurgical products were bottled up. Historian Justin Sledge hit the nail on the head regarding Scott's true legacy. He noted that these new alchemists grew out of the artisanal, esoteric craft world to become integrated into the emergent, pre-capitalist social economy as something truly modern. And that is exactly what happened. Scott dragged alchemy right out of the shadows. He took it away from the lonely, mystical hermits and turned it into a massive, industrial, quantitative pursuit. He was the bridge between the ancient world of hidden, secret knowledge and our early modern world of heavy industry, standardized measures, and state-sponsored scientific research. Which brings us to a really fascinating final thought. When you look back at all of it, the roaring furnaces, the massive crucibles, the highly precise 1.16 mass loss equations, and the heavy state funding of Michael Scott's massive operation in Spain, it really forces you to ask a question. Was the true magic of the medieval era the fictional, mythical transmutation of lead into gold? Or was the real, enduring magic the fiery birth of the scientific method itself, forged right there in the extreme heat and toxic fumes of the Toledo laboratory? I'll leave you to think about that one. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning what you think you know.